Alô, Cris, está me ouvindo?
Vê se tá, essa imagem aqui tá boa.
Vai.
A gente deixa no falar. Oi, testando. Tá saindo o som? Som. Tá?
gente, boa tarde. É um prazer receber vocês aqui hoje. Estou aqui com a professora Cíntia, minha vice-coordenadora, maravilhosa, dinâmica, poderosa. E a gente, na verdade, tem uma dupla razão para a gente estar aqui hoje, porque a Cíntia não só é a vice-coordenadora do programa de pós-graduação, mas ela também é parceira, né, co-diretora do Labim, Laboratório de Pesquisa sobre Imagem e Imaginário. E esse evento, então, na verdade, ele faz parte de uma série de atividades que a gente vai fazer ao longo do mês de agosto, que vão marcar a inauguração desse laboratório. Aliás, puxa, esqueci, eu não sei onde acabou de... Ah, está ali. Eu queria só ler para vocês o texto, pequenininho, curto, de apresentação do Labim. Obrigado.
Obrigada.
Que eu acho importante, inclusive porque é uma iniciativa que a gente pretende usar para congregar as duas linhas de pesquisa da pós-graduação e integrar também os alunos, né, dentro de um tema que eu acho que é um tema extremamente amplo, ambíguo, é difícil, né, de definir o conceito de imaginário, mas, ao mesmo tempo, eu acho extremamente atual e inclusivo, porque é um conceito que a gente pode aplicar, né, desde a antropologia até a política, os estudos de ciência política, de comunicação, em vários campos diferentes. E o Labim ele foi pensado exatamente para fazer estudos, buscar metodologias, desenvolver técnicas de investigação do imaginário nesses diferentes campos. Então, o que seria mais ou menos o mission statement, né? Não gosto muito desse vocabulário, parece meio empresarial. Mas o que seria o mission statement do Labim? O conceito de imaginário e o conjunto de noções que são frequentemente associadas a ele, mito, imaginação, símbolo, estão entre os mais ambíguos e de difícil definição no repertório instrumental das ciências humanas. Isso não nos impediu de receber a contínua atenção dos pesquisadores, particularmente nos últimos 30 anos com a consolidação das tecnologias digitais na vida cotidiana. Hoje, o recurso ao imaginário se dá em campos tão diferentes quanto as ciências políticas, a antropologia, a ciência das imagens, Bildwissenschaft, e o estudo das novas mídias. O Laboratório de Estudos da Imagem e do Imaginário, Labim, tem como objetivo se constituir em um centro de referência para a investigação dos impactos das imagens e a importância do imaginário nas sociedades contemporâneas. Trabalhando a partir mesmo da nebulosidade do conceito e buscando perspectivas múltiplas de aproximação aos fenômenos por ele implicados, o laboratório pretende investigar ainda as conexões das imagens e da imaginação a domínios teóricos correlatos, como o estudo das atmosferas ou ambiências no horizonte de uma nova estética, das materialidades da comunicação no campo das teorias da mídia e das culturas visuais em um contexto decolonial. De forma mais específica, trata-se de investigar a rentabilidade dessas ferramentas teóricas no domínio da política e da cultura no contexto da América Latina, com suas peculiaridades históricas, regionais e civilizacionais. Paralelamente à elaboração de bibliografias e inventários de autores, o laboratório propõe desenvolver novas metodologias e formas de investigação desses campos, com inspiração particular em epistemologias alternativas e práticas ainda pouco difundidas no domínio acadêmico, como, depois a gente pode explicar em outra ocasião o significado desses conceitos, o fictocriticismo, a hiperstição e as epistemologias do Sul. Então, esse é o objetivo do Labim, que a gente está inaugurando hoje com um auxílio que recebemos, né, de fontes como FAPERJ, CAPES, etc. E a gente, ao longo do mês, vai ter essa série de eventos. Hoje a gente inaugura, né, o primeiro evento com as palestras do professor Grusin, que é também nosso convidado no print, né, do Programa de Internacionalização da CAPES, e com a professora Fernanda Bruno, da UFRJ, da Escola de Comunicação da UFRJ. Amanhã a gente vai ter outras palestras. A má notícia, infelizmente, sempre tem que acontecer alguma coisa no pós-pandemia, é que o Roberto Rubio, nosso parceiro também da Rede Latino-Americana de Investigações de Imagens, pegou Covid, então não vai poder vir. Mas a gente vai ter palestra da professora Mercedes Lisca e da Julieta Leite, da professora Julieta Leite, amanhã, na parte da tarde. Na semana seguinte, segunda e terça-feira da semana seguinte, teremos também uma série de outras palestras, que vai durar esses 2 dias, e ainda temos o curso do professor André Lemos, né, que vai ser ministrado, curso intensivo, no final do mês, e ainda temos uma palestra surpresa no dia 11, né, que a gente vai anunciar em breve. Então, basicamente, todos esses eventos eles fazem parte de um conjunto pensado para a gente inaugurar, né, esse laboratório, que pretende ser um laboratório de investigações interdisciplinares. E, aproveitando, eu queria agradecer as pessoas que estão ajudando, ajudaram e continuam ajudando, né, isso tudo a acontecer. O nosso colega agora, professor Yuri, aqui do programa de pós-graduação, a professora Fátima, que infelizmente não pode estar presente hoje, também do programa de pós-graduação, a Carla, né, o Eduardo e outras pessoas cujo nome...
Cristiane, né, que é a equipe do CAC, né, do Laboratório CAC.
Que é o laboratório que a Cíntia também coordena. Então, Cíntia, você quer...
Não, e aí, já pegando esse gancho, né, eu acho que esse nosso feliz encontro, né, eu conheço o Erick há muitos anos, né, Erick, quando eu estava na sociologia, em outra encarnação ainda da minha vida, né, lá em Florianópolis, conheci Erick numa condição muito interessante, que ele foi lá para fundar o curso de uma universidade privada, e eu fui uma professora que fui convidada para a aula de sociologia, para ser a primeira professora que ia começar esse curso. O Erick estava lá. E a gente se conheceu naquela oportunidade, que nem sei que ano que era esse, né, 96 e tal. E eu nem pensava em migrar para, né, para a comunicação. Mas os meus sujeitos de pesquisa sempre eram atravessados pela comunicação, né? Então foi muito interessante. Depois eu reencontrei Erick na vida, né? E a gente também, e eu trabalho com a ideia de imaginário desde a minha tese de doutorado, né? Enfim, faço parte de uma rede de pesquisa que a Julieta também faz, né? Francesa. Então temos os nossos amigos Fábio Larroca, Vincenzo Susca, Philippe Joron, né? Trabalhamos aí com a questão de imaginário a partir de Gilbert Durand e outros, né, da escola francesa. E aí fundamos aqui uma linha de pesquisa no programa de pós-graduação, né, que é Cidade, Imaginário e Culturas das Mídias. E nós dois conversando, né, a gente tem tanta tese, e o pessoal de tecnologia também trabalha com imaginário, né, porque, na realidade, né, a cidade, tecnologia, imaginário e tecnologia é imaginário também, né, então a gente resolveu cruzar, a gente já fazia interlinhas, né, Vinícius? Né? Eu e Vinícius começamos, aí, quando éramos coordenadores do programa juntos, fundamos essa ideia também de que não vamos pensar mais as linhas do programa de pós-graduação como algo separado, mas sim, se a gente fala tanto de interdisciplinaridade, se nós viemos de formações outras que não a comunicação, por que a gente não faz isso também na nossa prática acadêmica e de pesquisa? Então, Simone, olha, nossa querida Simone está aqui. Oi, querida. Então, hoje nós estamos abrindo essa oportunidade, unindo tanto o Laboratório CAC, que é o laboratório, né, que foi fundado, o primeiro laboratório da pós-graduação foi Comunicação, Arte e Cidade, fundado aí pelo nosso querido João Maia, junto com o Elal. Depois o Elal funda um outro, mas Fernando trabalhava, né, várias pessoas da tecnologia e de cidade trabalhavam juntas no CAC. Então, hoje a gente funda o Labim, né, com a história também do laboratório de pesquisa, de onde também vem o professor Erick, e eu nesse não vou falar casamento, mas nesse namoro, né, e nessa amizade profunda que nós podemos ter, e que gostaríamos que todo mundo que viesse fazer parte viesse com alegria, né, com a alegria da pesquisa, que eu acho que esse é um ato político nosso, né, no Brasil hoje, né. Estamos aqui para isso, para sermos felizes com o que a gente faz, com a nossa pesquisa, né, e ocupando os espaços. Então, eu estou muito agradecida a todos e todas e todos que estão aqui hoje, eu e Erick, né, e estamos abertos aí a fazer as nossas tramas, e já começamos aqui, queremos já, Erick, o livro... somos poucos no Brasil também que estudamos a questão do imaginário, isso é muito importante, e Julieta não é à toa que vem aqui, né, convidada. Em Pernambuco, eles têm um grupo de pesquisa que já estão atuando, né, e estão criando agora também um novo laboratório, né, Julieta falará amanhã também um pouco sobre isso. Então, a Julieta Leite com a Lúcia Leitão e Eduardo, esqueci o sobrenome deles, Julieta, Eduardo Duarte, né? Que é da comunicação, né, do EPG da comunicação, também estão fundando lá em Recife estudos de imaginário, um laboratório. Então, é isso, né? Estamos aí navegando juntos nesses mares, né?
E só aproveitando para destacar também a presença aí do professor Nelson Job, da professora Paloma, professor Nelson Job do Instituto Transsaberes, professora Paloma do Instituto de Artes, né, da UERJ, que vão participar do evento dos dias 15 e 16. E, com isso, então, eu chamo o professor Yuri para compor a mesa, primeira mesa. E agradeço, claro, ao professor Richard Grusin, né, que está fazendo essa palestra para nós hoje.
Obrigada.
Depois do curso intensivo, magnífico que ele deu na semana passada.
Foi. Muito obrigada, gente. Muito obrigada.
Opa, obrigado. Prazer estar aqui diante de todos vocês, muitas pessoas que fizeram parte já da minha trajetória acadêmica ao longo de diversos anos, e rostos novos também, que é sempre interessante ver. Prazer estar aqui diante de vocês dessa abertura do Labim. A partir de agora eu vou começar a falar inglês em homenagem ao nosso convidado Richard Grusin, para que ele possa se sentir inteirado também de tudo. So Richard, I'm going to start speaking English from now on, so you can be into what's happening over here. So Richard is a fellow colleague of us from a long, long time, and I'm going to introduce him with his short bio that is actually not that short. He's been a very prolific theoretical researcher for some long time, so it's not that short, his bio. But Richard Grusin is a distinguished professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where he served as director of the Center for the 21st Century Studies from 2010 to 2015 and 2017 to 2021. He has published numerous articles and book chapters and authored 5 books: Transcendentalist Hermeneutics, Institutional Authority and the Higher Criticisms of the Bible, Remediation, Understanding New Media, that I imagine that is famous here for most of you, co-authored with Jay Bolter, Culture, Technology and Creation of America's National Parks, Premediation, Effect and Mediality After 9/11, and Radical Mediation, Cinema, Estética e Tecnologia Digital, translated by Angela Maiello from Italy. He has edited or co-edited 6 volumes of essays, all of Minnesota: The Non-Human Turn, 2015, The Anthropocene Feminism in 2017, After Extinction, 2018, Ends of Cinema, 2020, Insecurity in 2022, and The Long to 2020 in 2022. His current research is focused on the Arboreal Humanities, which he will talk about today in his presentation. So Richard, feel free to start whenever you feel comfortable. Thanks. It's a pleasure to have you here.
I won't wait that long to feel comfortable. Thank you. Okay. Thanks for being here. Apologies for the English. So this is brand new work. This is a new paper just written for this occasion, although I hope I will have other occasions to use it. And after working on a variety of different issues related to media, I've become quite excited about trees, and I hope maybe at the end of this talk you will be excited about trees as well. So I have a PowerPoint with some images and with some of the quotations that I'll be reading to help you a bit to follow. But I thought maybe just to give you a little idea before I started is I would play this 2-minute video from BBC News about the Wood Wide Web. Okay, so let's see. Hopefully, do we have volume? We'll find out.
Trees are in the place, so
that's pretty simple, but just to give you a little picture of, wait.
I think you can just close.
There we go. Okay, and bum, 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 bum. It always takes me a minute. I'm a Mac person, so I never can figure out where it moved. Here, Yuri, where do I make it big?
I'm probably the worst person to help you,
Okay.
but let's try.
Who can help me?
Normally there's an icon
Yeah, I know. I'm looking for the icon.
downstairs and
Apresentação, slide presentation.
Oh, I see. Up here?
here. Apresentação de slide.
No icon needed. Okay, so I changed the title a little bit to focus on the Wood Wide Web. You know, some of you, I hope, know my work on media, and so, like, why is this guy talking about trees? But as you'll see, there are interesting connections between them, and what I want to do is to challenge some of the ways to explain them and challenge some of the ways they've been understood. Can you hear me? Is this okay? All right, so I will read this. Wait, where's my, here. Well, that was dumb. Okay, Wood Wide Web, first section. Well, I'll leave it there. In the late 1990s, during the initial explosion of internet enthusiasm in the Western world, the concept of a wood wide web was adopted by botanists and other natural scientists, based upon research by Suzanne Simard and others, showing that trees reciprocally exchange nutrients with mycorrhizal fungi and other trees through their roots. And I put just mycorrhizal on the board there. Myco is fungus, fungal, and rhizal roots, rice. Perhaps because these interspecies exchanges created hyphal networks whose structure was analogous to the World Wide Web, the editors of the magazine Nature coined the phrase Wood Wide Web for the front cover of its 7th August 1997 issue, which featured the story The Ties That Bind. And that's almost exactly 25 years ago today. The author of the cover story, Sir David Reed, reported favorably on recent experimental findings by Simard and her associates, which are featured as a letter in the same issue. Interestingly, the phrase Wood Wide Web doesn't appear in either Reed's essay or Simard's piece. Nonetheless, the phrase stuck around. Beginning in 2012, its usage began to multiply significantly, continuing to increase for the past 10 years, and you can see the n-gram there. This analogy between arboreal mycorrhizal networks and technically mediated ones is part of a widespread arboreal imagination that has flourished in the popular media over the past. Simard herself has begun retroactively to use the phrase Wood Wide Web to describe the results of her doctoral and subsequent research. Born to a family of horse loggers in British Columbia, a horse logger is somebody not who logs horses, but uses horses to cut trees. Before the kind of clear cutting we see today. Simard's lifelong research project is directed squarely against the North American logging industry, particularly its wasteful, destructive practices of clear cutting and monocultural reforestation. Increased popular and cultural interest in trees and forests has been spurred on by similar concerns about the destructiveness of rampant deforestation, which threatens to increase global warming and contribute to the extinction of countless species. And Brazil in the Amazonia is probably ground zero for deforestation today. Simard's fullest expression of her research in terms of the Wood Wide Web occurs in her 2021 book, Finding the Mother Tree, an autobiographical account of her journey as a woman scientist making her way in the masculinist worlds of botany, forestry, and but she had already recounted the origins of her doctoral research in terms of the Wood Wide Web in the 2016 afterword to the English edition of Peter Wohleben's Hidden Life of Trees, which also argues for trees as sentient social beings. Wohleben is a German forester, and he's part of this large-scale arboreal imagining. So Simard, in the afterword she wrote for his book, writes, "In pulling back the forest floor using microscopic and genetic tools, I discovered that the vast below-ground mycelial network was a bustling community of mycorrhizal fungal species, as we saw in the video. These fungi are mutualistic. They connect the trees with the soil in a market exchange of carbon and nutrients and link the roots of paper birches and Douglas firs in a busy cooperative internet. When the interwoven birches and firs were spiked with stable and radioactive isotopes, I could see, using mass spectrometers and scintillation counters, carbon being transmitted back and forth between the trees like neurotransmitters firing in our own neural networks. The trees were communicating through the web." This discovery, Simard sums up, was published by Nature in 1997 and called the Wood Wide Web. In addition to noting the origin story of the phrase Wood Wide Web, this passage sets forth another analogy that reappears in her later work, the comparison between the structure and function of these underground mycorrhizal networks and those of the neural networks in the human brain. Not only do trees and fungi communicate through networks that function like the internet, but trees also transmit carbon molecules in networks that bear a topological resemblance to the neural networks of the human brain. So the same, what interests her and what creates this parallel in her mind is that our brain sends carbon molecules through its neural networks, just like trees send carbon molecules underground. In today's lecture, I explore some of the arboreal imaginings that inform these analogies between mycorrhizal and technical, or arboreal and human networks. Rather than embrace or dismiss the idea of a Wood Wide Web, I interrogate this intriguing comparison with the help of a variety of natural and human scientists, including botanist Francis Halle, neurobiologist Stefano Mancuso, philosopher Emmanuel Coccia, novelist Richard Powers, and others. In so doing, I hope to explore how technical human, arboreal, and mycorrhizal networks are linked by their participation in processes of radical tree mediation. I will conclude the talk by considering the effectiveness of metaphors like the Wood Wide Web in raising eco-political arboreal awareness. So section 2, Arboreal Humanities. Over the 25 years since Simard's research was featured on the cover of Nature, arboreal imaginings have blossomed, not only in the natural sciences, but in the human sciences as well. The analogy between arboreal and human networks has captured the scholarly imagination, helping to create what Solveig Nietzsche and Helga Brombeck call arboreal imaginaries, and what I've begun to call an arboreal humanities. So before turning to the question of tree mediation, I want to sketch out the conceptual framework and eco-political justification for the collective imaginary of the arboreal humanities. What do I mean by this term? Arboreal humanities can first be defined as a subset of environmental humanities. Like environmental humanities, whose urgency is intensified by global crises of climate change, environmental injustice, and other forms of slow violence, arboreal humanities has become more pressing because of the intensification of extractive practices like clear-cutting and deforestation, especially but not exclusively as a result of their contributions to global warming. And it's a really dramatic image of what a clear-cut forest looks like compared to one that has not been cut in the Amazon. Environmental and arboreal humanities are motivated by both ecological and political activism. Each shares a commitment to use humanities, texts, and methodologies to raise awareness of the historical roots and present-day circumstances of climate change in the era of the Anthropocene. And both seek to practice an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary methodology that overturns the divide between human and natural sciences. But trees hold a particularly interesting place in the human imagination, not only because of the wide distribution of forests across most of the planet's biospheres, but also because of their distinctive individuality in comparison to many other plants. Botanist Francis Hollet describes their, quote, mixture of unchanging presence yet complete otherness, noting that we are unable to keep from investing trees with human emotions and human language. Their branches become hands, their crowns heads, their roots feet. We see in trees both friendly and menacing moods, and we believe them capable of suffering if we wound them. The Ents in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings are only one familiar recent example of our culture's humanization of trees. And there are plenty more. Avatar is another good example of that, and then so forth. But the connection between humans and trees is not only a case of anthropomorphism, that's seeing nature as human. As Richard Powers notes in a sentence that recurs 3 times in his really masterful arboreal novel, The Overstory, you and the tree in your backyard or the tree in the streets come from a common ancestor. Powers' novel both anchors and has helped to establish the interdisciplinary canon of arboreal humanities, which could be broadly defined as including all forms of art, literature, science, and culture that concern themselves with trees and forests. Much like environmental humanities has created a new canon out of cultural and medial representations of nature and the environment. From Ovid's Metamorphoses, featuring several stories of people being turned into trees, to early modern works like Edmund Spenser's epic The Fairy Queen, to 19th century fairy tales and legends collected by the Brothers Grimm, or 19th and 20th century poets like Walt Whitman, Paul Valéry, or Francis Ponge, to contemporary novels like Annie Proulx's Barkskins, Powers' The Overstory, or Michael Christie's Greenwood. Western literature is replete with trees. The same is true of the visual arts. Paintings in particular are filled with trees, both as central subjects and as omnipresent features of landscape painting. The arboreal humanities has a well-forested canon of verbal and visual representations. The human fascination with trees also derives from their ubiquity in our daily lives. That is, from the vital importance of wood in providing raw materials for human dwellings and other structures. So many of the objects with which we regularly engage, houses in which we live, furnishings with which we interact, paper on which we write, and so much more, are made of wood and derived from trees. And, oh, sorry, I missed a slide. Valerie Trouet writes, the many archaeological and historical wood remnants, buildings, water wells, artifacts, charcoal, tree stumps, represent only a fraction of the ways in which we have leveraged this unparalleled natural resource. Wood has been used to make weapons for hunting and warfare, to make tools, furniture, sports equipment, woodblock printing, and paper, even making possible the written word as you see it in this very book today. Wood was the primary source of energy, both in homes and in industry, up until the Industrial Revolution and the pervasion of fossil fuels. It's no exaggeration to say that human civilization as we know it is founded on trees. Humans are intertwined with trees in ways we do not always fully acknowledge. Indeed, more than 100 years ago, anatomist Grafton Elliott Smith proposed that primate evolution was accelerated by adaptation to arboreal life, from moving in the up to live in trees, which fostered the development of perspectival sight over smell. That is, as primates, sight is our dominant sense, not smell, complex depth perception, and the grasping abilities of feet and hands. If you live in a tree, you've got to be able to grasp branches and so forth. It might not be overstating the case to think of the human reliance on wood, for example, as one instance of what we could call the coevolution of humans and even of the humanities with trees. Third section, plant theory. As an academic concern, arboreal humanities does not emerge directly from the broader enterprise of environmental humanities, but branches out from what has been called plant theory, or what Natasha Myers described in 2015 as the plant turn, a recent swerve in attention to the fascinating lives of plants among philosophers, anthropologists, popular science writers, and their widely distributed, electronically mediated publics. Although I don't have time here today for a full discussion of this turn to plants, it's really a really fast-growing field, it's important to lay out a few of its recurrent claims. And one of the interesting connections is what's the relationship between trees and plants? Because much of what's true about plants is also true about trees. But there are many things that are true about trees that aren't true about plants, so it's an interesting relation. Plant theorists like Emmanuel Coccia, Michael Marder, Jeffrey Nealon, and Matthew Hall have underscored the marginalization or exclusion of plants from the Western philosophic tradition. Plants are often placed at the bottom of a hierarchy of living organisms because of their lack, variously, depending who's putting them there, of a soul, their lack of the ability to move, of feelings or sensation. Plant theorists often contrast this devaluation with the recent philosophical revaluation of animals, reflected in the development over the past few decades of animal studies as an interdisciplinary academic field of research. The decentering of the human in animal studies, plant theorists argue, mainly extends some of the privileges of the human to animals, leaving the ontological dualism between animal and plant life, or even human and non-human life, firmly in place. So this goes back at least to Aristotle, this sort of exclusion of plants, or the treatment of plants as something completely different from either animal life or human life. The recent turn to plants in the popular and scholarly imagination has been spurred on by the work of indigenous authors, whose traditions, unlike those predominant in the Western world, have long treated plants, like human and non-human animals, as persons. Shaman Davi Kopanawa, in collaboration with anthropologist Bruce Albert, has powerfully articulated the Yanomami belief that the forest is alive, but is being threatened by the destructive actions of white people, as in that slide I showed of the Amazon. Anishinaabe scientists in the North America, like Robin Wall Kimmerer and Mary Genius, have written brilliantly on the interconnections of native cosmologies with Western science. Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, it's a wonderful book, which narrates in part the difficulties she encountered as an indigenous woman in her efforts to integrate Western science with Anishinaabe traditional knowledge, has become something of a bestseller and is regularly assigned reading on college and university syllabi across the curriculum. Natural scientists like Mancuso, Halle, Daniel Shamovitz, and others have similarly criticized the overwhelming prejudice of the biological sciences in favor of animals. In their arguments for the increased attention to the intelligence of plants, these scientists have worked tirelessly to overcome what they characterize as plant blindness in Western culture and science, a failure to see plants in the relentless focus on human and animal being. And I think it's Halle, I'm not sure, or it might be Mancuso, did an experiment where they had a series of photographs, and the photographs were of different animal or human life in a forest. And so there were many trees in the image, but the center was an animal or a human. And they changed over slides. So they asked students, what do you see in this slide? And the students never mentioned the trees. They only mentioned, oh, this is one human. This is a dog. This is a bear. You know, this is what they call plant blindness. We just don't see trees. And we don't see plants as well. Natural scientists often cite as importance, or as evidence for the importance of plants, the fact that they make up over 80% of the Earth's biomass, of the living mass of the Earth, while animals make up less than 1/2 of 1%. As if to demonstrate their point about plant blindness, almost every graphic I have found to illustrate the biomass of plants, even those in articles with headlines like "Plants are the world's dominant life form," almost every graphic is accompanied by a detailed breakdown of the 0.5% biomass of animals, while plants are lumped together in a single category. So you can see that tiny little blue dot of 0.5% gets its own big square where they break down all the differences. Meanwhile, the 80% of Earth's biomass of plants are just called plants. The more complex differentiation of animal life in these charts ironically reproduces one of the key features distinguishing animals from plants. Animals have evolved by differentiating the basic functions of life, like cognition, perception, nutrition, digestion, waste, reproduction, and distributing them to different organs. This is the animal strategy. These organs cannot be divided from the rest of the animal. Without a brain, heart, or lungs, for example, an animal cannot continue to live. In plants, as Mancuso and Alessandra Viola tell us, these vital functions are distributed throughout the leaves, stems, and roots. If part of a plant is removed, new growth will replace it, just like yesterday. Animals are, in that sense, literally individuals. That is, they cannot be divided and survive. Our body, they write, really is indivisible. If we're cut in half, the two halves can't live separately. They die. But if we cut a plant in half, the two parts can still live independently for the simple reason that a plant isn't an individual. Plants, in fact, are Deleuzian dividuals, multiply divisible beings that generate new growth, new individuals, when they are divided into two or more parts. And they continue, in fact, the right way to think about a tree, a cactus, or a shrub is not to compare it to a human being or any other animal, but to picture it as a colony. A tree is much more like a colony of bees or ants than an individual animal. Whether understood as a colony or a network, individual trees are also elements of the larger colony or community of mycorrhizal networks that, taken together, make up a forest. So one of the politically interesting things about trees is the way in which they exist collectively and communally. They used to be thought that trees would compete with each other, that they needed sun, and so trees would fight each other to try to get to the sun. But what this new research has shown is that trees actually share nutrients with each other. And especially larger trees share nutrients with the young trees that are too small to get the sun to create the photosynthesis to produce their own energy. So trees live like collectively a kind of socialist form of life rather than our capitalist form, the form that informs Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest, for example. Section 4, there are 5 sections. Plants are the real mediators. Excuse me. Too much smoking. If plants make up more than 80% of the Earth's biomass, trees make up the largest part of the plant biomass. Almost anything true of plants, I said earlier, is also true of trees, although the reverse is not always the case. The coevolution of humans and trees is in some sense only a special case of the coevolution of plant and animal life on the planet. Trees are, as philosopher David Wood describes them, the lungs of the earth, our silent and invisible CO2 partners, breathing in as we breathe out. Mancuso, and this is why trees are so important for climate, is because they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and release oxygen in. Mancuso, Coccia, and others remind us that the oxygen which animals breathe has been produced by plants and trees, without which there would be no animal life on Earth as we know it. Understanding plants, Mancuso and Viola write, is becoming more and more important. They enabled our coming into existence on Earth through photosynthesis, creating the oxygen that made animal life possible. And today we still depend on them for our survival. They're at the base of the food chain. Even when we eat meat, we're eating meat that's been fed on plants. They're also the origin of energy sources, fossil fuels, that have sustained our civilization for thousands of years. Emitting the oxygen that animals need to live as a byproduct of photosynthesis, emitting the oxygen that animals need to live as a byproduct of photosynthesis, plants make animal life on Earth possible. If all animal species were to disappear, including us, which is probably likely someday, plant life would continue without very much change at all. But if all plant life were to disappear, animals would soon follow them into extinction. While human and non-human animals are dependent on plant life for their continued existence, this dependence is not mutual but asymmetric. As Powers imagines repeatedly in The Overstory, when humans are gone, plants and trees will get on just fine without us, as they did before we primates came down from our arboreal homes. Emanuela Coccia explains this dependence of plant life, or of animal life on plants and trees, in terms of the immediacy of plant mediation. Unlike plants, he claims, higher life seems never to have had immediate relations with the inanimate world. That is, animal life's relationship with the inanimate world, rocks, stones, water, etc., is mediated by plants. Coccia himself remediates the idealist claim, expressed most powerfully by Hegel, that humans can never have an immediate relationship with the world by denying such immediacy to higher life more generally, even while ascribing immediacy to plants. Because so-called higher forms of life are parasitic on energy provided by the lives of other living beings for their sustenance, they do not have an immediate relation with the material world. But plants, Coccia writes, have no need for the mediation of other beings in order to survive, nor do they desire it. Plants require nothing but the world, nothing but reality in its most basic components: rocks, water, air, light. It's really interesting when you think about it that plants actually live off of non-living elements: rocks, air, water, and light. We couldn't do that. Now, when I was in college, I had a friend who worked with me in the library, the bookmobile driver, and he was into transcendental meditation. And he took a week vacation once to go to Iowa, where he said there was a guru who was so enlightened that he was able to live by photosynthesis, only by drinking water and sitting in the sun and meditating. I don't believe that, but it's just an example of how remarkable that would be and how remarkable plants are as life forms. Knowingly or not, in invoking the immediacy of plants' relation to the world, Coccia echoes a well-known passage from American transcendentalist Henry David Thoreau. And Thoreau writes in The Maine Woods, "Talk of mysteries. Think of our life in nature, daily to be shown matter, to come in contact with it, rocks, trees, wind on our cheeks, the solid earth, the actual world, the common sense. Contact. Who are we? Where are we?" Considered in light of Coccia's understanding of the immediacy of plant life's relation to the world, Thoreau's desire for contact with the material world, what his mentor and fellow transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson describes as an original relation to the universe, can be seen to manifest a desire for what Deleuze and Guattari might call becoming plant. Because they produce their own atmospheric environment and the environment for terrestrial life in general, plants disrupt the fundamental logical opposition between the individual and the environment upon which so much of the life sciences is based. Coccia writes, "Plants are the real mediators. They are the first eyes that appeared and opened themselves onto the world. They are the gaze that came to perceive it in all its forms. The world is above all everything the plants could make of it. They are the ones who made our world, even though the status of this making is quite different from that of any other activity of living beings." Coccia's description of plants as the real mediators echoes a claim by Deleuze in an essay called Mediators, that mediators are fundamental. Deleuze writes, creation is all about mediators. Without them, nothing happens. They can be people, for a philosopher, artists, or scientists, for a scientists, philosophers, or artists, but things too, he writes, even plants or animals, as in Carlos Castaneda. Or as I've rewritten this passage in relation to radical mediation, without mediation, nothing happens. Creation is all about mediation. As forms of mediation, radical mediation, plants are ontogenetic. That is, they bring themselves into being and bring other lives. They do not come belatedly, and ontogenetic students in the class my class last week will recognize Simondon behind that term. Plants do not come belatedly after the habitable world and its animal life are already in place, but create the conditions from which the conceptual opposition between animal life and the world or environment can emerge. Plants in their history and evolution demonstrate that living beings produce the space in which they live rather than being forced to adapt to it. So it's not that there's living space already there. Plants produce the very living space in which we live. They've modified the metaphysical structure of the world for good. And that's a quote from Kocha again. What Kocha means by this is that plants provide an alternative to a dualistic ontology in which natural and by extension technical forms are understood as separate from their creators. He writes, plants coincide with the forms they invent. All forms are, for them, inflections of being, and not merely of doing or acting. To the abstraction of creation and technique, which are able to transform the forms only at the cost of excluding the creator and producer of the process of transformation, the plant opposes the immediacy of metamorphosis. To generate always means to transform oneself. To the paradoxes of consciousness, which does not know how to conceptualize forms without first distinguishing them from itself and from the reality of which they're modeled, the plant opposes the absolute intimacy between subject, matter, and imagination. To imagine is to become what one imagines. In an implicit critique of Aristotelian hylomorphism, again, you can see the connections between the work on mediation here and the work on trees and plants. In an implicit critique of Aristotelian hylomorphism, in which all natural beings are composed of two distinct qualities, matter and form, Kocha contends that the forms plants take are not produced by some agent or action external to them, but that their forms coincide with their very being. So their being is their form. Form in plants is not distinct from matter, but absolutely intimate with it. To imagine is to become what one imagines. I mean, it would be a wonderful talent to have as a human, right? But we don't have it, only plants do. Kocha explains this absolute intimacy between subject matter and imagination in terms of breath, writing that leaves and all other life co-create the atmosphere and the biosphere through breath or breathing. The world is the matter, the form, the space, and the reality of breath. Plants are the breath of all living beings, the world as breath. Breath is the art of mixture, what allows each object to mix with the rest of the objects, to immerse itself in them. Atmosphere, the sphere of breath, that's its etymology, its extreme horizon is the form of intimacy and unity that defines itself not through the homogeneity of substance or form, not because there's just one substance, but through the sharing of the same breath of a family resemblance among a collection of elements that is not a simple combination of disparate objects. This is a really important point. So what he's saying, when you think about it, with every breath we take, we are mixing ourself with the atmosphere. This is, so the idea of thinking of a human being as an autonomous being separate from the environment we live, it just completely ignores the fact that we only live because we take breath in, take in atmosphere, which already has been created by plants, so we're mixing both with the atmosphere, but we're mixing with the entire biosphere, we're mixing with plants themselves. So this is a really powerful attack on the kind of fundamental logical dualism that has really ruled Western thought for more than 2 millennia. So this is a really important point. Koch's idea of mixture is key to the life of plants and to life generally, has affinities with Karen Barad's sense that bodies, whether human or non-human, should not be thought of as organisms living in the environment of the world, but must be understood as inseparable parts of the very fabric of the world. So our bodies aren't separate from the environment, we are mixed and connected with it. Our breaths are always mixing with the atmosphere which circulates through bodies in order for them to live. In other words, breath is radical mediation, not coming in between the living being and the world, but helping to generate the very atmospheric medium which makes terrestrial life possible. In the process of breathing, our living bodies are always producing mixtures or mediations which then mix with and change or remediate the atmosphere, environment, or medium in an ongoing cycle. When living beings stop mediating and remediating the atmosphere, they die. If radical mediation is a fundamental process of human and non-human existence, which I argue in the essay of that name, and life itself is a form of mediation, what can that tell us about the analogy underlying the concept of a wood wide web, that trees communicate through mycorrhizal networks just like humans communicate through the World Wide Web? Okay, last section, tree mediation. It's not so short, though, so bear with me. Like trees and the mycorrhizal networks that connect them, plants too have recently come to be understood as sharing affinities with the Internet's distributed modular structure. Mancuso and Viola explain that what ultimately distinguishes a plant from an animal is its divisibility, as we said. Its numerous command centers and a network of structure like the Internet's. In discussing how plants communicate, similarly to animals, they contend that despite the similarities, a plant's internal communication pathways have a completely different architecture from those of an animal. Whereas animals are equipped with a central brain toward which all the signals are directed, plants, by virtue of their modular and iterative construction, utilize multiple data processing centers which permit them a very different sort of signal handling. Mancuso contends that each plant is a living internet network. So we see the metaphor of the internet applied both to plants and to trees. One of the liberatory aims of arboreal humanities, like plant theory generally, is to advocate for trees and plants by presenting them as intelligent, complex social beings. Whether addressed to disciplinary or interdisciplinary, academic or public audiences, the argument goes something like this. If humans can be made to understand how trees communicate with one another like people, how they share with their neighbors and protect their kin like people, how they act collectively and altruistically like people, then it should not be difficult to make the case that trees and plants should have rights like people. These rights should be taken into account before clear-cutting a pine forest in Western Canada or destroying parts of an Amazonian rainforest for ranching and so forth. Rights like these should be written into the constitutions of all nation states and international organizations, much like the way they are currently being set forth in Chile, where proposed constitutional amendments, including such rights, will be voted on in September. But I wonder if the best way to extend to trees and plants the right to live is and protected from violence is by making the case that they're like us. Is this the best way to do it? This is my question. If we use human intelligence and sociality and technology as the measures of arboreal complexity, are we just sort of hubristically perpetuating an invidious distinction between human and non-human life? Oh yeah, they're like us, and so we should save them too. Okay, in all of these analogies between humans and non-humans, the arboreal humanities wants to make an argument for trees and forests not just as resources or commodities, but as complex, multi-species collective organisms that need to be protected, nurtured, and encouraged, not destroyed. Trees have rights like we do, or they should. But if we look at this in light of plant theory, the analogies of trees and plants like us could be seen to reproduce the hylomorphism that Kocha, Mancuso, and others have shown plants and trees to resist by imposing the form of human networks onto plants and trees. What if, rather than starting with neural and technical networks as the measure of arboreal and plant intelligence, we turned this around and began instead with tree mediation? What if instead of considering trees as taking the form of the internet, we considered the internet as taking the form of trees? Does it make sense to consider human cognition and communication networks as themselves arboreal? That is, thinking of us as trees, not them as like humans. What would it mean to think of technical networks and mycorrhizal networks as the same kind of things? Do trees communicate and share and cooperate and care like humans, or do humans do these things like trees do? Are trees like us, or are we like them? This is not just a matter of words, nor is it a version of now familiar arguments for or against anthropocentrism, thinking only from the human view. The choice between anthropocentrism and biocentrism is a false choice, an offshoot of the fundamental dualism that has dominated Western culture for more than 2 millennia. If that's the choice that's posed between human knowledge and the knowledge of non-humans, I refuse to choose. I don't want that distinction. I want to begin in the middle with relationality or mediation, with the very mixture that is breath. Well, we should, rather than value trees and forests because they're complex like us, I wonder if we shouldn't instead reconsider the ways that humans might be complex like them. Perhaps we should think of human cognition, communication, sociality on the model of tree mediation, rather than granting trees a kind of a human intelligence according to our own sense of human exceptionalism as self-conscious free agents with the power of language or speech. What if we understood these powers of language of speech on the model of trees? In other words, what if our language and knowledge evolved according to contiguity, as new rings are added to trees and new branches and buds are added every year, rather than through similarity or resemblance, through metaphor between different kinds of things, almost through. Language use has for centuries been a key part of the argument for human exceptionalism, particularly language understood on the model of mimesis, where humans use language to imitate something other or non-human, and on the model of metaphor, which assigns to humans the unique ability to express linguistically resemblances between unlike things. We have claimed that we are the only creatures that can do this. What if we saw the question of resemblance not through metaphor, but through metonymy, not through similarity of different kinds of things, let's say language in the world, but actually through physical contiguity, I mean, I haven't been able to talk enough about this, but the way a tree grows every year starts out and it creates a little bit of growth and then a ring, and it's got the bark. And then the next year from the inside, it creates another ring and it grows out and so forth. So each year, it's like accretive. Every year is connected to every other year. Then the branches split and that branch split. So it's not about separating one way of being from another way of being, like language from the world. It's actually about communicating through making connections, through networks that are always metonymically related to each other, part of each other, rather than separate. Okay. Recurring crosscuts, thinking about how trees grow, of a tree resemble one another if you cut a tree through the trunk. But they resemble not through similarity or metaphor, but through contiguity, because one is next to the other. Can trees show us a way to think about human language as operating not based on metaphor, where a word stands for or represents something it's not, but on metonymy or contiguity? What would it mean to consider language producing language as trees branch and rebranch year after year? Jakobson proves to be an effective guide to such matters of metaphor and metonymy. Okay, last paragraph then. I want to conclude by suggesting that in co-evolving with technology, as many anthropologists have said, Leroy Goran, Simondon, Stiegler, others, humans have been co-evolving with the arboreal, with trees. Also, that this co-evolution means that both humans and techne are evolving, and that technology is not ontologically other from nature, but is itself natural, growing along with humans like the trunk of a tree creates the infrastructure to hold up the living tree. Other thing amazing about trees, that it creates its own infrastructure from the inside, the dead wood that holds up these huge trees. The co-evolution of humans and technology is articulated largely in the French Academy, from Leroy Goran, Simondon and Stiegler to Tard, Serre, and Latour, can be seen as a consequence of the co-evolution of humans and trees. Perhaps because the move to trees of primates living in trees did spur certain distinctively evolutionary traits, but perhaps even more significantly because the technology with which humans have co-evolved was for the longest time and remains very much made out of wood. Weapons, tools, conveyances, houses, and furnishings, all made from wood, as I've said. Ironically, it's with the advent of the digital revolution and technical networks like the internet that paper has begun to give way to the silicon and metal platforms of digital code. And digital code, actually interesting, is uses like plants do, or not just code, digital technologies like plants create their lives, so to speak, from material worlds, but they need energy that comes from life. But the comparison of these two networks, of arboreal networks and technical networks, points to arboreality in a different way, less as material of communication and information and knowledge, and more to the ways in which trees and computer code grow. Like trees, computer code depends upon branching, if then, right? These are how algorithms work. Branching is the fundamental structure of computer code. But rather than see this as a reason to say that trees are like computer code, I think that out of respect for our ancient biological ancestors, the more meaningful way to understand these relationships is to say that computer code, like humans, are in fact like trees. Thank you.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
longer than I thought.
Thank you very much, Richard. It was longer than you imagined, but it was great. And we still have time for a few questions, so now I would like to open it for the public to pose your questions. Emmanuel?
I saw some interesting about ants, something Fatima is very
Yeah.
interested about.
Right.
Ants and etc. And there's something nice about that. They started farming when trees went down, like when the atmosphere couldn't hold trees anymore. It was very hard to find food. They started growing fungus inside
The roots or the dead tree?
Side the land?
na terra, gente. Essa é a palavra.
Land?
No,
Ground?
underground, thanks. Underground, they started to grow fungus to hold themselves, to feed themselves. And so they started to evolve depending on those fungus, and the fungus started to evolve to need the ants. So they need each other to survive. And we didn't have the same thing. We don't understand how we depend on them to survive and how we can't keep them going on and surviving themselves. So I just, when you were saying that, I just remember that those ants still do that when they have no trees.
Yeah.
They evolve a tree back.
And so insects are very different, and insects like ants, a lot of people question whether ants are individuals, that really an ant colony, people think, is the organism. It's not the individual itself, it's the whole collectivity. And I mean, ants are super interesting in the way that they create all these very elaborate structures, again, not in the way that somebody thinks of a form and imposes that form on matter in the traditional hylomorphic way, but each ant makes a decision, and together those decisions end up creating this collective form of the trails underground or the big mounds that sometimes ants make and so forth. So yeah, they're very interesting. Slime molds is another very interesting organism that also demonstrates intelligence by very individual decisions. And so I think that I think natural science is a very interesting place for us to be thinking about in this age of new digital mediation and new digital technologies and digital networks, because they, on the one hand, provide models for how we understand our networks so that we can say, oh yeah, you know, ants are like us. But also in the other way, I think we can begin to think that maybe we don't create in that same way either. And maybe we too are making a series of individual decisions that collectively produce these more complex forms. There's a lot, the lines between natural science and philosophy and human science, media science, communication science becomes really impossible to draw, and really exciting, I think, to think about. Thank you.
Someone else? Eric?
I think the plant turn is one aspect of the larger turn, the idea of non-human turn,
Right.
which is the title of one of the books and one conference at the C21. And that's super interesting, of course, because we're learning to look at things from another perspective, which tries to be non-anthropocentric. But on the other hand, we still use the terminology and we still talk about the humanities. So that's an interesting question because deep down, man is still at the center of this perspective, in terms at least of some of the concepts and terminology. So do you have any ideas of how we can change the humanities into something that works not only from a human perspective, but also of these other beings, like, you know, machines,
Right.
animals, and plants?
So, yeah, I mean, it's a complicated issue. And so when I skipped over at the end because I wanted to leave time for questions. So I talk a little more in there about the distinction between anthropocentrism and biocentrism, which is a distinction that deep ecology made in the late 20th century especially. And what they said is that we used to, even creating parks thinks about nature from our perspective. A park is a place for recreation. A park is a place we can take a hike, we can, do things. And deep ecologists wanted us to think about parks from the perspective of, and nature from its own perspective. The problem with the question is I actually refuse that distinction. And so when you say that, when we talk about the humanities, we're thinking about it from a human perspective, that's only true if the human is understood as fundamentally different from the non-human. And I want to deny that the human is fundamentally different from the non-human. So that when we talk about the humanities, we are talking about the non-humanities. When we talk about plants and trees, we're not, there are ways we can talk about it that ignore their agency, but I want to try to understand, what if we step back, right, and think about humans on this planet from the perspective of extraterrestrial beings and look at humans as if we are like ants or something like that. And so much of what we do as a human, even to talk, okay, when I talk, I'm breathing for one thing, so I'm already mixing in with the world. But how do I make the sounds? What's happening with my muscles? What are all of these things going on? All of those are not, there's nothing specially human about that. That is, other animals have the same features. So I really want us to stop. We can ask the question, but I think the answer is to refuse to separate them. It's not that we can posit, what if they were, it's been done for 2,000 years. But that doing actually has taken a lot of effort. I first started thinking this way in about 2002 when Donna Haraway gave a lecture in Detroit, where I was teaching that at Wayne State University. And the way she put it, and she still puts it in ways like this, she said, the distinction between a human and a non-human, like here's a human, here's a non-human, or here's a subject, and I'm a subject, and you're objects, but then from you, right, you're a subject. But she said, the world is not full of those distinctions. Everything is really mixed up in the world. The world is made of things that are all interconnected and mixed up. Now, we can posit and we can make separations, but those separations, this is, I think, what the problem is. I don't want us to think that that's where we start. We don't begin with a separation between human and non-human. We can, through language, through thought, through writing, we can sort them out. But the separation comes later. It's the separation that is secondary and derivative, not the mediation in the middle. So when Hegel says, you've got the subject and the object, you've got spirit and matter, and he says we as humans can never have an immediate relation with the world. We always need mediation in the middle, and mediation is seen as secondary. It comes later, belatedly. It's an afterthought. I think it's the opposite. I think it's the mixing and the mediation is where we are, and that we can then, through the work that we've done in civilization, make separations, and it can be functional to do that. But that's not how the world is. And I really think the more you start flipping that in your thinking, the more the world looks differently, and also I think there are a lot of different ethical choices that one would make as a result. And I think, so this is an act, as we're talking about imagination here, what I'm trying to get us to do through this arboreal imagining is through an act of imagination to imagine a kind of reversal of that kind of ontological order or hierarchy. So, yeah. It's not easy.
Maybe a good approximation. I think you're already doing this, but I see some relation with the biohacking movement. People that try to make same thing that media hackers are doing in technology of biology, giving access to information. But when you treat with this kind of knowledge, is always an issue of what's ethical, because you can cause some imbalance in nature like this. So maybe the aesthetic aspect of the work is very important, because when you're dealing with words and the way you deal with the words, to translate one field to another, because as Erick said, this term to allow humanities to talk about natural science or physics or engineering, things like that. So I remember I saw one situation, I don't remember where I saw it, maybe a Wired magazine, something like this, that people are coding, for example, animated GIF in a DNA of a plant. And you finished your lecture talking about the similarities in between computer language and nature language. And it's curious because artificial life researchers, I see artificial life as in programmers that develop code like genetic code for machine learning. You have things like Conway Game of Life, Langton's ants, simulations of nature. A cell, a pixel is like a cell that reproduces itself. So I think it's a field to media studies work. You can say a lot about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great, I think thinking about that kind of biohacking is super interesting. The reason that the people who are opposed to that kind of genetic hacking and so forth, right, and there are probably reasons to oppose it, but mostly the opposition comes in a very simple way. You're messing with nature, and, God made the world like it is, and we shouldn't, or something like that. So I think that instead of saying it shouldn't be done, because we do it all the time in lots of ways, we have to figure out which are the kinds of hacking we might, that might be ethical and might not create damage now, not just to us, but damage to the collective, thinking about Gaia, the whole planet as an organism. That's where we have to make those choices. But you're right, this work is already happening. And the thing is that, like what Kocha said about breath and mixture and so forth, that work isn't violating some pure difference between nature and technology. That work is actually reproducing, in a still probably much simpler way, the kind of things that the natural world has been doing for way longer than we've been here. For millions of years. So yeah, it's a super interesting subject. If you read the novel, The Overstory, one of the main characters there is a computer programmer who makes these virtual worlds that are self-creating, and a lot of the stuff about him is precisely about the relation between coding and the branching of trees and the creation of these kind of virtual lives and virtual worlds. So, yeah, again, I don't want to say they're the same. I don't want to say a virtual world is the same as this world. I think it's a pale imitation or a pale version of real worlds, because I think bodies are really important, and they're important because bodies have been created for so many.
Yeah. What I say is that I see the media studies as a mediator of all those fields. I'll give you a short example. I was in Pixel Festival in Norway. There was a lot of open source groups doing experiments. There's a group called
thing about imagination and imagination creating these things is it doesn't have to have a specific utilitarian result, right? It may have a result we have no idea, you know, in 100 years or 50 years or whatever, or it may not. But, you know, this is what nature does. I don't think nature is interested in, you know, specific usefulness in a way. Nature is like this mad scientist that's mixing and making all these crazy things. So, yeah.
I'll thank you if there's no other questions. Richard gave us a 5-day course here for the students, and during his course, wonderful course, he was giving examples about Biscoito Globo all the time and reminding that he never ate them. He only knew they existed. So the students, as saying thank you to you, they prepared a surprise for you, a gift for those classes, and I would like to call them to give you.
Sorry, excuse me, but this is so cute.
You
The
got
name
me
of all
some
the students
global.
that came in the 5 days. It was wonderful. We were talking all day about your classes. You made us get closer, makes us find new friendships, and talk about your book and etc. Makes us all interested in trees. You made that too. So that's a little gift.
Oh, look.
And inside,
God, thank you.
there's a
I
kind
have-
of a beach essentials you can find. We have global. It's a sweet one and a salty one, so you know which one you like more.
Okay, and I can mix them,
You
right?
can mix them.
Because I'm into mixing. Thank you, that's so sweet.
Before we go to the coffee break, can I just make a quick observation
Yeah.
question for your Richard, because I think that the talk was so rich. There's so many different questions involved in what you presented us today. And I was thinking, because of course I'm partial, I also have to mention Flusser. And maybe we disagree on this point, but I think like at least 70% of what you said today and some of what these people have said is already in Flusser.
Everything is already in Flusser. Okay, Eric, you tell me where I should look. Okay. Great.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's have a coffee break now. Okay, 10-minute coffee break.
Thank you.